Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tigerites, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. And if you are looking to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we are doing chapter 46 of Breaking Step. So, Jekyll nodded toward the sorcerer at the counter, speaking with Maz, as Tibs sat at their table. You don't hate his guts anymore? We talked. Immediately that sounded inadequate. I listened. He didn't lie when he said he was scared we wouldn't let him on the team. He was correct, Kumdar said. Without Tirania forcing the issue, you would not have allowed him to join. I know. Tibbs watched the exchange between the archer and sorcerer turn heated, and people step away from them. It was mainly Mez talking and gesturing, and Don looking penitent. I couldn't see past how he'd been, he shrugged. But I believe him when he says he wants to be better. Believe? The cleric asked. Or no? He's being truthful when he says he wants to change, Tibbs replied. But that's what light sees. It can't know if he'll stick to it. You have to get Void for that, Jekyll said between bites. I'd rather not, Tibbs shuddered. They all seemed to turn strange. Khrushchev placed a plate of spicy-smelling meat and vegetables before Tibbs. I'm proud of you. He squeezed his shoulder, putting the tankard next to the plate. Tibbs didn't feel like he'd done anything worth being proud of. It had taken being confronted by his own hypocrisy before he'd done the right thing. The server nodded to Don in greeting as they crossed paths. Then he and the archer sat at the table. You two going to be okay? Jekyll asked. We'll see. Mez started eating, then paused. But you don't have to worry about me shooting him in the back anymore. He made it clear he'd look me in the eyes before planting an arrow into me, Don added. It's always good to know it's coming, Jekyll said. That way you can think about what you did to deserve it. Thank you for the advice, the sorcerer said, sarcasm slipping into the tone. I'll make sure to face you the next time you deserve being punched. Mez rolled his eyes. Shoot him with corruption. You'll just break your hand if you punch him. And I do not believe that is an action warranting the use of a healing potion, Kumdar added. We know clerics, don't we? Don asked. The cleric smiled. But how many of them like you? Don opened his mouth, closed it, then narrowed his eye at Tibbs. You know, I'm starting to regret this being better thing. The words glowed. It was a lot easier to get stuff when I just went around scaring people into giving it to me. Poor little sorcerer, Miss said. However shall you survive it? You are so lucky I promised to be nicer to you, Bizzano, Don said, trying to sound threatening. The archer beamed. Don't worry, I'll take full advantage of that. Jekyll, can I get your permission to punch the archer? Not unless he does something to deserve it, the fighter answered, barely pausing and eating. He's... Don sighed. You know, you guys are supposed to be the nice ones. But this is us being nice, Jekyll replied in an offended tone. We let you back on the team, didn't we? Just so I could suffer, Don muttered. You simply aren't seeing the way they torture each other, Khrushchev said as he placed food and drink before the sorcerer. Don't worry. Once the novelty passes, you'll see they aren't treating you any different than they treat each other. He paused. Other than Tibbs, he has this way of never ending up on the receiving end of others' barbs. I'm a rogue, Tibbs replied casually. We're good at avoiding blame. Tibbs walked among the booths, filling the field in front of the cliff wall. The cliff's wall? Cliff wall? Cliff's wall. Yeah. It seemed that each time he was here, there were more of them, as well as buildings. If this kept up, there would be no telling Craggle Rock from the dungeon's waiting area. Yeah, that works. There'd be no telling Craggle Rock from the dungeon's, although that's not capitalized, the dungeon's waiting area. It was probably what had happened with the Purity dungeon. Merchants hawked their wares to runners, waiting for their turn in the dungeon, or others looking at what was available and how they could how it could help them survive. Tib's immediate reaction was annoyance at the merchants taking advantage of newer runners with barely any coins to spend. To spend, still? To spend. But as he looked at them, okay. But as he looked at them, dressed in worn but better clothing and armor than he remembered getting from Stowe even after months of running him, he realized that he might be wrong about how few coins they had, or how inexperienced the surviving runners were. Had Stowe become more generous on the first floor? Had Tibbs been too focused on everything else he needed to do to notice the faster improvement? Everyone assembled had an element which spoke to experience. He found the team he was assigned to easily enough. Paladin argued with one of the guards at the bottom of the steps. They were better equipped than the other teams. Paladin and Silas, the metal user, were garbed in chainmail. Paladin had a mace hooked to his belt and a shield on his back, while his brother had a sword on each hip. The archer, Carlan, wore heavy leather armor and held an intricately carved bow. Lamberto's armor was lighter, more thick fabric with leather sewn, so yes, sewn in where he needed more protection, and had a handful of knives at his belt. Gabriel, okay, that's the female version of the word of the name. Gabriel had the usual sorcerer's robe, although hers was decorated with symbols and black thread throughout the light blue material. It all looked like it had been purchased just before they stepped onto the field and had light weaves of varying elements that Tibbs figured added protection and efficacy to the items as the items demanded. Tibbs! Lamberto yelled, waving enthusiastically. We're here! He pushed the annoyance down. It was like the boy didn't understand the danger they were preparing for. Did he think this was a visit to Montancy? He couldn't think of anything close to a dungeon that wouldn't feel life-threatening. You, Paladin demanded, tell him to let us through. Is it our turn? Tibbs asked. We're early, Silas answered. The other team's not out, the guard said. Then we're waiting, Tibbs said. The guard looked them over. It's only 5 to a team. Tibbs took the paper the clerk had delivered to his room this morning, along with letting him know today was when Lamberto's team went in, and handed it over. They're getting preferential treatment. He couldn't tell if he kept the disgust out of his voice, as per Tirania's instruction. And then we're going in now, Paladin stated. No, Tibbs faced the team leader. Only one team on the floor at a time. The schedule told you when your time was. If the team isn't out by then, it's fine to go in since they'll be considered to have fed the dungeon. How often does that happen on the first floor? He asked without turning. It hasn't happened since I've joined. The guard handed. I think here I went with he because I wanted to establish the guard's gender. But you know what? It's not actually relevant. The guard handed the paper back to Tibbs. Then we wait until they exit. He led them away. How much training do you have with your weapons? I'll be happy to give you a demonstration, Silas said, smiling menacingly as he ran a hand over the pommel of a sword. Tibbs couldn't tell if the eagerness was because he felt Tibbs needed to be put in his place, or the noble just liked fighting too much. Fighting isn't allowed outside the training field. Training fields, the fighters snorted. We've all had as much training as we could get before coming, Gabriel said. How good are you with those? He asked Lamberto, indicating the knives at his belt. I'm okay. You should get a sword, Tibbs replied. I can introduce you to a merchant that won't scam you. But I'm the team's rogue, Lamberto protested. Rogues use knives. Rogues use whatever gives them the best chance to win. He formed his sword, and only Lamberto didn't step back. Instead, the noble rogue looked at the jagged blade with awe. Tibbs was starting to think anything he'd do would cause that reaction. We don't go by the rules. We don't work. We don't. We don't follow it. We don't follow the rules. We don't follow the rules. Lightfinger. Lightfingers, the guard called. You're up. The team walking down the stairs had ripped and bloody armors and clothes, but they were grinning, and there were 5 of them. Paladin hurried up the steps, and the others kept up with him. Tibs trailed behind. The guard at the door stopped him, and Tibs handed the paper. Should we start expecting this with all the noble teams? She asked, handing it back after reading it. I hope not, Tibs muttered. She smiled, and he added, you need to check with Iridian or Tirania. She only told me about this one run. I don't plan on doing this again. Tibs still asked once he was on the other side of the door. What's going on here? There's already 5 of them. You're much too strong. You're much stronger than they are. I'm just escorting them, he whispered. Even if the others were already at the trigger room's entrance, they'll do all the work. So you aren't here to make sure they survive? Tibs snorted. That was what Tirania had implied when she said she wanted them to have a good impression of the dungeon, but he had no intention of doing more than offering advice. She knew now Galdane had no choice in moving here, he told her. He might even have managed not to sound mocking in the process. So whatever need to impress a noble, she still, you know what, the noble. To impress the noble, she still felt was on her. On her. About time you arrived, Paladin said, emotion to the room. Lead the way. Tibs got an impression of straight walls with decorations before the fighter was in his face. Listen here, street trash. I'm the leader of this team, and you're going to do what I tell you. Paladin, Lamberto said, trying to interpose himself. Don't be like that. Tibs nice enough to. The fighter shoved him out of the way. Don't get involved, Lamb. You'll just get hurt. It's okay, Lamberto, Tibs said, smiling. Gabriel helped her brother to his feet. I can handle him. The fighter snorted. Just say the word, Paladin, Silas said, hands gripping the pommel of his still sheathed sword. We're in the dungeon now, kid. We can do anything we want to you. You are, Tibs replied, the smile slowly forming in my dungeon. So think about what you're planning to do carefully. Whatever training you received, I got mine surviving 3 floors in here. None of your trainers were as merciless as this dungeon. I've lost countless friends to him, and the only reason I didn't join them is that I got better. You think I'm impressed with someone like you? I'm impressed that someone like you was lucky and cheated his way through all this? Silas sneered. Luck's not a thing. Okay, Stowe grumbled. I don't like him. And I don't care if you're impressed or not, Tibs continued. Surviving in here didn't teach me to go easy on those who attack me. You can't kill us, Paladin stated. If you mean I'm not strong enough to do it, you're wrong. If you mean I'm not allowed, he locked eyes with the leader. Like your brother pointed out, we're in the dungeon. If I'm the only one who walks out, who's going to question how you died? Tibs? Lamberto asked, worried. He let out a breath and pushed the mounting anger down. That isn't my plan, Lamberto. I'm just going to injure them, and then they'll have to worry about surviving the run in that state. He shifted his attention to Silas. If you want that, Paladin, tell your brother to attack me. Otherwise, you're wasting time. He motioned to the time shield atop the wall. That's how long you have until the next team comes in. The more time you spend trying to convince me I have to obey you, the less you have to reach the boss room. Which one is more important to you? The sound of Silas pulling the swords out was the only one accompanying the glare Tibs could feel from their leader. Fine, Paladin said when the swords were half unsheathed. Stop! Lamberto called out. What do you want, Lamb? Paladin snapped, turning away from putting a foot inside the trap room to face him. You really want to walk through that without knowing it's safe? Gabriel said, while Lamberto was fighting against withering under the glare. There's nothing there. And what did Father say about dungeons? Carlan asked in a calm tone. Yes, I know I'm not carrying the tone. Paladin ground his teeth. Nothing's ever easy. He moved away from the room's entrance. Fine, Lamb, make yourself useful. Lamberto stepped to the edge, and Tibs joined him. The room had indeed changed. There were no traces of the cavern from his runs. It was a six-sided room with irregular tiles over the floor and colored hexagonal tiles on the walls, and the stone spear holes camouflaged in the shadowed gaps between tiles and the walls. Well, that is clunky. There are the tiles on the floor and colored tiles on the floor with with the stone hidden in the shadowed gap between them. Um, it was a sort of with irregular tiles on the floor. Okay, you know what? This is going to close the phrase. Um, the walls were covered with colored hexagonal tiles with the stone spear holes hidden in the shadowed gaps between them. It seemed Stowe had removed those from the floor. The cache stood out to him, but he studied the colors, finding the pattern in them and matching them to the tiles on the floor. Sensing those which had triggers, real and decoys, showed him the code hidden within showing the code hidden within how the wall was tiled. It was relatively simple simple to decode, he thought, so long as Lamberto thought to study them, then notice the details on the floor tiles. Do you? The boy swallowed, then tried again. And when he tried again, there was more confidence in his voice and body language. Do you have any advice? Tibbs looked over his shoulder to confirm the others had moved far enough away and were busy talking among themselves. Before that, I'm sorry about how I treated you during the party. You were nice to me, and all I did was be rude to you. You don't excuse bad behavior, Lamberto. Not from anyone. He fought the urge to glare at Paladin's back, especially not from yourself once you realize what you've done. As for the room, how much practice do you have with locks, traps, and triggers? I've mainly read about them. Tip stared at him. You've read about them? Lamberto nodded. Father also paid one of the city's best thieves to teach me, but he wouldn't let him teach me lock picking. He sounded disappointed. But Tibbs was still stuck on the previous things. You read about traps? The chuckle escaped, and with it some pain, but her memory had lost some of the bite. She'd been right. Again, there were books out there about rogue stuff. Why he doubted her, or was surprised, was beyond him. Carina had pretty much always been right. What? Lamberto looked at him strangely. Tim shook his head. Just remember an argument I had with a friend about books and things thieves would share. He smiled as he remembered her laughter. What did your teacher say about traps? That if I'm not careful, I can trigger it instead of disarming it. Tibbs nodded and looked the room over, considering what to say. The first thing about the dungeon is the first thing about the dungeon is that there's always a way through the room. No two room will have the exact same way, but it's there. And it's a way that allows everyone on your team to cross it. If a room looks impossible to beat, it's because you haven't looked at it the correct way yet. You need to make them understand that, Lamberto. That the dungeon isn't something you rush blindly through. That he's clever and he will outsmart you. You just need to learn from that and get better. He took a breath. And your team has to learn to respect you. You are as important as each of them. More so, as far as I'm concerned. He smiled. But what else would a rogue say, right? He looked over his shoulder, and Paladin was glaring at them. He lowered his voice more. I know they're your family, but if they can't respect what your role on the team is, you need to find another one. Otherwise, they'll get you killed. They aren't that bad, Lamberto said, taking a leather roll from his belt and unrolling it. It's just that having to come here was upsetting to everyone. Father wouldn't let Paladin stay behind, and he lost all the friends he had. He was nicer before. He stretched on the floor with his arms only in enough to work the first tile. You'll see once you know them better. Tibs didn't expect he'd ever see that side of them. Nobles would never be nice to someone like him. A lot of them saw. All a lot of them saw was street, and he forced the thought to stop. They weren't all like that. Amelia treated him with respect. Her friends did too, if begrudgingly. Lamberto treated him like, certainly not like Tibs was street trash. You have to remember, not all nobles were the same. It would be a lot easier if more of them weren't so nasty. But that didn't mean he could excuse his own bad behavior. Another thing, you don't have to finish the floor. If you don't think you can survive a room, you need to get them to turn around so you can all live and try on your next run. Lamberto made a non-committal sound as he used the pick and lever along the tile's gap. Tibs sensed the pick touch the mechanism and forced himself not to react to the click that caused the click that caused as the trap triggered, or at Paladin suddenly being there, pulling his brother away from the stone as the stone pier crossed the space over the tile well above where Lamberto had been stretched, chest height if he'd been standing. You okay, Lam? And was that concern? And that was concern in Paladin's voice. I'm fine, his brother complained, shaking his foot out of the grip. Silas stepped before Tibs. Let's make one thing perfectly clear. If you let Lamb be hurt in any way, there isn't going to be enough left behind once I'm done with you for the dungeon to eat. Tib's only response was to raise an eyebrow at the bravado, but there was no light on the words. The noble fully intended to go through with it to ensure his brother's survival. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for the entire team after all. And that concludes chapter 46 of Breaking Step. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter is going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story, it is up on Royal Road for free. If you want to read ahead and support me, that is on my Patreon, where it's about 20 chapters ahead at this time. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the note. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.